Good day and welcome to the Japan Society's regular webinar on current affairs and business. I'm Bill Emmott, and as many of you know, I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the Japan Society. This week, our topic is about the future of the United Kingdom, or more specifically about Scotland's place in the UK and what it might mean for the UK as an economy, as a market, as a place in which to do business. In this country, the UK, in other words, we have spent nearly 5 years now debating Brexit, a debate which is largely centered on trade-offs between sovereignty and economic interests, between identity and wider national strategy, between the nimble choices a self-contained government might make versus the advantages of scale and scope when part of a larger entity. Now, with elections to the Scottish Parliament on May the 6th, and then an inevitable discussion about whether there can and should be another referendum on Scottish independence, we will be moving those same debates up north to Scotland's place in the United Kingdom, with the key difference that Scotland has been part of the United Kingdom for more than 3 centuries, whereas Britain was in the EU for just 4 decades. To frame this debate for us, I'm delighted to welcome 3 stellar experts from quite differing points of view. From Glasgow, from Strathclyde University in Scotland, I welcome Sir John Curtice, who is widely recognised as one of the UK's top scrutineers of opinion polls, and who leads the very helpful and non-partisan research service, which I recommend, What Scotland Thinks. From London, I welcome Iain Martin, a journalist and editor who's long been a prominent voice on Scottish and UK national issues, first as editor of The Scotsman and The Scotsman on Sunday, then as a columnist on The Times, and now also as editor and publisher of Reaction, an online provider of analysis. And finally, from Edinburgh, or just outside Edinburgh, I welcome Andrew Wilson, an economist who now heads a communications business, Charlotte Street Partners, but has also been an aide to Alex Salmond when he led the Scottish National Party, has been an SNP member of the Scottish Assembly, and most recently and importantly, chaired a body analysing the economic future of an independent Scotland, called the Sustainable Growth Commission, which delivered its report to First Minister Nicola Sturgeon in 2018. I'm going to ask our 3 speakers to give us brief opening remarks, followed by discussion and, crucially, your questions. Please, as usual, submit them using the Q&A function, and feel free to vote for other people's questions so as to bring them more quickly to my attention. I will start with John Curtice to tell us what Scotland currently thinks. John Curtice, welcome to the Japan Society. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for the invitation to talk about this. Bill, in his opening remarks, mentioned Brexit, and I think I take the view that the position in Scotland now and the debate that we're having in Scotland is really another installment in Britain's Brexit chapter. But let me explain. Scotland, of course, back in 2014, had a referendum on whether or not it should become an independent country. It voted against, but the margin of 55% for staying inside the United Kingdom and 45% for yes was certainly much narrower than the polls suggested might be the case when the referendum was agreed to 2 years previously, and certainly much narrower than I think many in the unionist camp had been anticipating when David Cameron, the then Conservative Prime Minister, acceded to the idea that a referendum should be held. Yet, during that referendum, we spent a great deal of time arguing about whether or not an independent Scotland would or would not be able to be a continuing member of the European Union, i.e. if it became independent, would it simply take up its bit of the UK's membership, or would it have to apply as a new state? The SNP took the view that it could be a continuing member. The UK government differed on that, and President Barroso, the then President of the European Commission, was inclined to agree with the UK government. One of the ironies, however, of that debate is that it proved to be a complete waste of time so far as influencing the electorate is concerned, because one of the things we know from survey research is that whether or not you were skeptical about the European Union or thought warmly about it was unrelated to whether or not you voted yes or no to independence. Indeed, we can move the dial forward to the 2016 EU referendum. And again, we know from survey data that yes, Scotland voted by 62% to 38% to remain in the European Union, a very different result from that in England and Wales. But actually, those people who had voted yes back in 2014 were no more or no less likely to vote Remain than were those who had voted no. So in other words, again, even at the time of the EU referendum, even though the SNP's vision of independence has long been independence within the European Union, actually the issue of Britain's membership of the EU and people's attitudes towards Scotland's constitutional question continued to be unrelated to each other. However, that is something which has changed fundamentally during the course of the last 5 years, as of course has also the elite level politics. Let me deal with the elite level politics first. As I already said, Scotland voted to remain, the SNP wanted to remain. The SNP's initial reaction was to pitch for a relatively soft Brexit, something not dissimilar to Norway's relationship with the European Union. And certainly the Scottish Government took the view that even if the rest of the UK did not want to continue to be part of the EU's single market, Scotland should be allowed to do so, and indeed also to continue to accept freedom of movement. Pretty clear, however, by the time of Theresa May's Mansion House speech in January 2017, that was not going to happen. And by March of 2017, Nicola Sturgeon was calling for another referendum. The Scottish National Party in the 2016 election has said, well, we're not sure we want another referendum, but if there were to be a, quote, material change in circumstance, we would want one. And the kind of outcome that there was in the EU referendum was cited as a possible example. Indeed, the Scottish Parliament voted for another referendum. Then, however, the June 2017 general election intervened, during the course of which the SNP, which had won 56 of Scotland's 59 Westminster seats in 2015, the SNP suffered something of reverse. This was widely interpreted, I think in my view, wholly mistakenly, but it was widely interpreted as a rebuff to Nicola Sturgeon's plans to hold another second independence referendum. And certainly in the wake of that election, the SNP said things were going to go back on hold. Left on hold for a long time, then the pandemic came along, and that also again put it on hold, which is why basically at this election, the question of whether or not there should be a referendum is central to the SNP's platform. But of course, in the meantime, also, despite the attempts of those on the Remain side to stop Brexit, prospect of holding another second EU referendum, which might have come up with a different result, Brexit has happened. So what was something that perhaps might have happened at the time of the 2016 Scottish Parliament election was something whose shape was unknown in 2017, but whose shape was only eventually determined in 2019. It is now clear the UK has left the European Union with a relatively hard Brexit. But what about public opinion? What's happened there? The SNP certainly anticipated that in the wake of the divergent outcome of the EU referendum on the two sides of the border, that there would be an increase in support for independence. That actually did not transpire for quite some time. However, underneath the surface, an important change was occurring. Because yes, as the SNP anticipated, some of those people who had voted no and Remain were switching to yes, but they were being counterbalanced by some of those who had voted yes and Leave, who were now saying, well, actually, I want to stay inside the United Kingdom. And therefore, the polls gradually began to discover that support for independence was rising amongst Remain voters, but falling amongst Leave voters. And those two movements cancelled each other out until 2019. During 2019, it became clear that support for independence had risen. It was running at about 49% for yes, 51% for no. And crucially, all of the increase in support for independence occurred amongst those who voted Remain. And I think there is no gainsaying the fact that the reason why we are now in this situation where Scotland is split down the middle on independence, as opposed to there being at least a narrow majority in favour of the Union, is indeed the pursuit of Brexit and the way in which some people in Scotland have reacted to that. Now, during the course of last year, support for independence rose even further. During the course of the pandemic, that seems to have rode back again, but we are still left in a situation where it's 50%, 50%. And then you have to realise one other crucial thing about this election, which again is different from previous circumstances. Not only is Scotland now divided down the middle on the question of its constitutional status, but the question of Scotland's constitutional status is playing a greater role in determining who is and who isn't willing to vote for the SNP than on any previous occasion. Back in 2011, when the SNP got an overall majority, it was done on the back of nearly 40% of those people who at that time didn't want independence, but were willing to vote for the SNP because they thought they could run the devolved administration more effectively. Indeed, even in 2016, around 1 in 5 of opponents of independence voted for the SNP, whereas only around 80% of those who were in favour of independence did so. Those days are over. Around 90% of those people who now say they're in favour say they're going to vote for the SNP, and of course these are disproportionately also Remain supporters, and meanwhile only around 9% of those people who are opposed to independence say they're going to vote for the SNP. So the constitutional question is now central to this election, and in effect, whatever any of the parties might want, it looks as though the voters at least have decided that actually this election on May the 6th is itself a quasi-referendum, and the outcome of which is certainly, I think, going to play an important role in determining what is the future of the Union thereafter.
Marvellous. Thank you, John. That's really set the picture beautifully, that this, as you said, quasi-referendum that seems to be coming up on May the 6th. I'm going to start now with Iain Martin to give the case for the status quo, the case for Scotland staying in the Union and the prospects of whether it will, and then we'll follow with the Andrew Wilson offering the pro-independence point of view. Iain, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you for your invite. And great to see John Curtice again with that typically brilliant overview of the situation. Look, I never made any secret of the fact that I am a unionist. I'm British and Scottish, and it's clear that the situation for those of us who want the union to survive and prosper, that the situation is, how can I phrase this politely, suboptimal. And the backdrop as described by John is that it looks as though in this election for the devolved Parliament, looks as though it's going to be a slam dunk for the nationalists, looks as though Nicola Sturgeon has grown in popularity because of her leadership during the pandemic, where she's seen by Scots as having responded well, and she's been on television every single day leading the sort of media briefing. That looks to be paying off, and it looks as though after May the 6th, there will be a majority in the Scottish Parliament, not just the SNP, but other parties like the Greens, who will agitate for and advocate a second referendum. I think it's worth just touching on briefly on what this indicates about UK politics, because I don't think it's just happening in Scotland in isolation. Function of how UK politics is changing, and the way in which you're seeing also the development of a distinctly English politics in England, where it's often overlooked and forgotten, but where the Conservatives are polling 47%, sometimes closer to 50% among English voters. So Boris Johnson as Prime Minister is actually very popular in England and has a huge connection with working class. He's created this new coalition for the Conservatives of the working class and lower middle class in the north of England and the more prosperous parts of the south. That's very powerful politically, but it has an English character, which obviously is not popular in Scotland. And Scotland has the reverse. It has a a party which is polling close to 50%, which is led by Nicola Sturgeon. And then you're also starting to see interesting things stirring in Wales, and in the elections in May. It's worth looking out for whether there is a proper surge this time for Welsh nationalists. So it looks also, in Scotland in particular, as though young voters are particularly, to use a Scottish word, scunnered with the union and just regard it as being a question beyond economics, and being a question of culture and identification, and that they look south of the border and see the Conservatives in the position that I described and simply feel repulsed by it, as though it is nothing to do with them or should have nothing to do with them. So on that basis, a lot of people are confidently predicting that this will mean the breakup of the union, which I accept as a unionist could happen. But I think there are reasons for unionists not to despair, and there are reasons to make a proud and passionate defense of the union. We've just had a textbook example during the pandemic crisis of why and how the union works as one of the most successful examples of resource sharing and collective national endeavor in Western European history, stretching back 300 years. Firstly, the UK vaccine program, where the UK decided to go its own route, stressing global cooperation and working with pharma, but driven by a national UK level response to procure vaccines early. And while this terrible crisis has got many twists and turns left to come, I think even the most anti sort of UK or union person would acknowledge that the UK has performed well in that regard, and performing on vaccines during a pandemic well strikes me as something in the course of 40, 50 years of history as something really rather significant. Secondly, the fiscal and monetary response, the combination of the UK borrowing firepower and the ability at speed to offer help to business. Nationalists in Scotland don't really accept that this is the case and are still talking about austerity, which is just hilarious considering the extraordinary rate at which the UK state is showering money across the United Kingdom during the crisis. Is all rather amusing. Now, the other aspect, we touched on Brexit, and I'm sure it will come up in the questions, is that once this element of the crisis is over, the reality is that Brexit and the negotiations with the European Union were extremely difficult. Brexit actually makes Scottish independence more complex as a proposition. It does not make it impossible. I'm not in the unionist school of thought, and never have been, that says that Scotland cannot ever be independent, that it is incapable of running itself as a completely separate Scottish state. That's not my contention. My contention is that the adjustment over the course of 10 or 20 years would be very painful, and that we would be giving up this extraordinary union, this great cooperative enterprise, which I think has served the people of these islands very well. But because of Brexit now, if Scotland votes for independence, it will be effectively constructing a border, a trade border at Carlisle or above Carlisle, across the middle of these islands between England and Scotland. That is simply a reality because it's SNP policy to rejoin the European Union. I'm sure we'll get into other difficulties as they crop up in questions. But this is obviously going to be a huge question, continues to be a huge question in British affairs for the next decade or so. All I would say, while being aware of the dangers of confirmation bias and wanting this to be true, which is we should always remember conditions what people say about the union question, because people get very emotional about it. But my view would be that the UK is in considerable amount of trouble, but far from finished. And I hope that over the course of the next decade that people see the sense in continued cooperation and maintaining the UK.
Great, thank you very much, Iain. And we will, under questions, pursue some of those issues, including routes towards maintaining the UK that don't involve independence. I think we should discuss to some extent as well. Now, Andrew Wilson, over to you. Iain has described the situation as suboptimal from his point of view. I think, therefore, must be optimal from your point of view.
Can I just say thank you very much to you, Bill, for the invite. Sir John actually taught me statistics when I was a 20-year-old student at Strathclyde, and Iain's been my good friend for over 20 years, and we've never agreed on almost anything, but we've agreed on something. So it's great to be part of this discussion. I should say at the start, also in response to Iain, that I regard myself as Scottish, British and European. The identity doesn't need to reflect how we are governed. In fact, identity is about so much more than that. The other thing to say for your audience is that Scottish nationalism is avidly civic. It's not based on ethnicity at all. And the proof point for that is if I told you that the Edinburgh University election study from 2014 found that the majority of people born in Scotland voted for independence in 2014. No one cares. No one's ever made that point because it doesn't matter. Because if you come to live in Scotland, you have equal say and legitimacy in the future of the country as if your family have been there for 12 centuries. So it's just to be aware of that. John's right, obviously, to identify that everything feels 50-50 at the moment. I don't think independence is certain at all. But as Iain alluded to, one poll last week from Ipsos Murray had 70% of people under the age of 45 in favour, 64% of people under the age of 55. So I guess the judgment here is that a cohort that won't change their mind, or do people change their mind when they get older and more mature, more risk averse, more reflective? I've heard that. My sense is that views have deepened, though. But we'll see. Nothing is certain. My view, however, and this we can come on to discuss it, but one of your early questions, I think, pointed to this, is if this is going to happen, it needs to happen in a manner which is orderly, which is the opposite of populism, which is democratically legitimate, which entirely sets out in advance what it will mean, what the implications are, how the transition will work, what the risks are, that it will be challenging, and I agree it will be challenging, but the case must rest or fall on whether or not people believe that in the long term, it will be worth it. Now, I would be one of those advocating that I do believe, for a whole variety of reasons, that it will be worth it. But this must not be won on a populist non-manifesto. It must be the antithesis of, and therefore the antidote to, Brexit itself. There was a wonderful event this week at the Blavatnik School at Oxford where Sir Tom Devine, and I've actually no idea what Sir Tom Devine thinks of Scotland's future, because he always says, as a historian, the future is not his period. But he ended the whole event saying that the case for independence, if it was to be put, must be intellectually honest, and I concur. Prior to that, in that event, Kieran Martin, very senior former UK official and civil servant, pointed up on the process point, do we or don't we get a referendum, that he felt it was not sustainable for the UK to be governed and held together on the basis of law and enforcement rather than consent and effectively democratic legitimacy. And that's the question that will be tested in this election that's coming up. It does not feel sustainable. I mean, the UK could delegitimise any vote of the Scottish Parliament because the UK Parliament is, of course, in our system, sovereign, and therefore it can legislate and change its mind on almost anything at any point. The point here really is one that most prime ministers in the post-war period have agreed, which is if the Scots determine they want to go a different route, then the UK ought to be pragmatic and flexible enough to accommodate that. And really, it would be in everyone's interest, if that was the decision that was taken, that the negotiations were fulfilled in an orderly fashion and the outcome was one that could be as constructive as possible for a whole variety of reasons that we can come on to discuss. Which I suppose brings us to the final point, is why do we want to do it in the first place? Well, as John said, both the fact and, from my perspective, the manner of Brexit, no prospectus, disorderly, and in the end, a hard exit, it was the material adverse change that means that the referendum is back on. The UK's performance, was first in the world in terms of GDP per head at the end of the 19th and the start of the 20th century. Today on the IMF measures, it's 22nd. So one of the big judgments for Scotland is, should all of our eggs in trading and in every other sense be in a basket that is declining, relatively speaking, or is there greater opportunity as part of the European Union or not? Within the UK, the other major issue the UK has wrestled with and not been able to resolve is regional inequality. The most regionally unequal country in the developed world. There's a reason the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, have appointed Sir Angus Deaton to look at inequalities in the UK. And many of the reasons you hear, which are criticisms of independence, are really criticisms of the current UK model, which makes it very difficult to transition. Goes the argument whether it's deficits or indeed borders or trade. I don't think there's any doubt that unpicking a 300-year-old union will be very, very challenging. But I do think if we can emulate over the next generation good policies, and this is what it boils down to, do we trust ourselves to get the right policies, the correct policies to succeed, or are we more likely to get policies suited to Scotland from Westminster? And that ultimately will be the judgment that people deliberate on, Bill, not just in this election, but potentially in a referendum, which ought not to come until the pandemic in health terms is behind us, and all the focus will be on who leads us to the next stage of life. And just a final little point, just to endorse Iain's point, I think, of all the different things that have given evidence of the collapse of statecraft in the UK governing system in the last few years, the one, beacon, if you like, was Kate Bingham's work on the vaccine programme, which was, I tell you that it's a superb example of Britain at its best, and there's no doubt about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So let's, and that's very, powerfully and very reasonably put as well, if I may say. Let me start by addressing this question about referendum or not referendum. If you get the outcome of the elections on May the 6th that really all of you seem to agree is the likeliest one, what happens in Westminster politics? I mean, Iain, Boris Johnson's general strategy is brazening things out, essentially, whatever it is. Yeah. We won't list them.
I know we've only got half an hour.
Yeah,
you couldn't cover
all
how brazen Boris is in half an hour. Yes, I mean, I think it depends on a couple of things. The result itself, actually, this hinges, and both Andrew and John have explained how Scotland is split 50-50. Actually, on this election, it rests on really quite fine margins, because the difference between the SNP getting an overall majority and landing just short of it, which would be a real setback for the Nationalists, considering how popular Nicola Sturgeon is and how divided their enemies are. It comes down to almost a kind of roll of the dice in electoral terms and the vagaries of a rather complex electoral system. So that's the first thing. If the SNP falls just short, and turnout, which we don't, John will know better than I, but turnout tends to be low for Scottish Parliament elections. If they're just short of an overall majority, saying that Scotland was clamouring for an instant referendum, they didn't get the majority, and the turnout began with a 5, low 50s perhaps, then I think the SNP will be on much weaker ground. I don't think it will matter that there are other parties like the Greens or possibly Alex Salmond's party with a few seats off the list, adding up to a supermajority. The number that London will be focused on is that SNP number. Now, I think what will happen then is that if they do have a majority, the SNP has a majority, Boris can probably for about a year to a year and a half say, come on, there's a pandemic on, don't be ridiculous. There are bigger things to worry about. When it then becomes more difficult is when you get into 2023, you're coming up towards the next Westminster general election. And if the SNP has a majority, I accept as a unionist, I don't quite now know how he will handle this, but I accept that it then becomes very difficult to resist asking the question again.
John, do you have a view on that? And perhaps one should toss into that. I mean, I live in Ireland, and a lot of people commented here that in Ireland they had the civil war after independence, whereas the Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon battle was the civil war before independence. What impact?
Well, I think Iain is absolutely right that the crucial question is whether the SNP get an overall majority. The reason why that matters is essentially that if the SNP have an overall majority on their own, then the precedent of 2011 can be cited. And as it were, in British constitutional practice, precedent is often regarded as important. The SNP's success in getting an overall majority in 2011 was, as I said earlier, followed by the acceptance that they had the moral right to hold a referendum. And there are essentially two questions that would arise. One is, well, if it was good enough then, why not now? The second is that, although I think it's perfectly reasonable for the unionist parties to argue all the way between now and May the 6th that there shouldn't be another referendum, that the SNP in 2014 said it was a once-in-a-generation opportunity, etc., etc., the question you have to ask yourself is that if indeed the SNP do get an overall majority on the back of a manifesto that is saying we want a referendum, full stop, if you aren't willing to accept that that is an expression of the democratic will of an electorate, then what would you accept? And that does take me forward slightly, because I think, you know, it's worth remembering that the idea of holding a referendum in order to try to secure independence was actually the creature of electoral weakness, so far as the SNP is concerned. Andrew Wilson probably remembers much more of this than I do. But I mean, that stance of, you know, we will hold a referendum on independence was the creature of around the 1990s. And it was designed to say to people, because at that stage it was perfectly clear that only a minority of people in Scotland wanted independence, that you can safely vote for us, because if you don't like independence, you can vote against it in the referendum. And as I suggested earlier, it was very successful in that respect for quite a while. But before that, SNP policy was that if we get an overall majority of the seats in either a devolved parliament or of the Scottish seats at Westminster, then that would be a mandate for independence, full stop, okay? Now, the fact that now the SNP basically are no longer winning voters on the other side of the constitutional divide, and B, there are so many voters on their side of the divide, and C, the SNP are now able to win seats quite easily in a Westminster election. But I think one of the things that unions will have to think about is if you do succeed in denying the SNP a referendum, what will be its reaction? And one possible reaction will be to go back to its previous policy and go into the 2023 or 2024 Westminster saying, if you vote for us, it's a vote for independence. And then bear in mind, it's a lot for the SNP to get a majority of the Westminster seats for Scotland than it ever is to win a referendum. And they will then cite as a precedent 1918 and Ireland, etc. So while undoubtedly holding any kind of referendum is a major risk for the unionists, it frankly also is going to be one hell of a risk for the SNP. And you have to think forward about what happens otherwise. The potential prospect is an SNP that is forced action on the back of a mandate for independence, and that SNP ends up being the hinge party in a hung parliament after 2024, which I think might probably be the worst possible nightmare that the Westminster Parliament could manage to conceive of for itself.
Andrew, let's go over to you and just...
I'll be brief, just
the strategy, yeah.
A couple of points to make. First is I'd love anyone to tell me any parliamentary system in the world where there is an election based on proportional representation, where there is a government with an overall majority. So the system of PR is designed to ensure that that doesn't happen. Scottish devolution explicitly was intended to do that. There are 5 parties in the Parliament. What's different this time is that the Greens also have in their manifesto support for a referendum, which they didn't have the last time. So I don't think a majority of SNP MSPs is the hurdle, because it's really about the vote of the Parliament itself. Kieran Martin concurred with that in his lecture at Blavatnik this week. I think it's a massive hurdle to produce an overall majority of SNP MSPs. This is a 4th term government. Highly unlikely. Could happen. I think it's highly unlikely. But this is all about legitimacy, which brings me to the second challenge and point. John's right, the SNP position changed, but it changed post-devolution happening. You know, when the Scottish Parliament was set up, it needed a different approach. And really being able to negotiate independence with a minority of the vote, but a majority of MPs is not ever really a sustainable position. What we have now is a means by which the democratic will can be tested, and that's a big hurdle. That is a big hurdle, and it's by no means certain. But it has, to my earlier point, Bill, it has to be done legitimately, because the whole point, the reason we're here, is the quest to get back into the European Union. If Scotland was to approach this a la Catalonia, or with an approach which was deemed non-constitutional from a UK perspective, then clearly Spain would veto, they can veto, would veto, in much the same way as they would support Montenegrin accession because Serbia recognises it, but don't support Kosovan accession for the same reason. So legitimacy really counts. And I think, again, just to sweep back up Iain's point, when Theresa May said those years ago that now is not the time, that actually reflected what Scottish people thought, and they went on to express that view at the next ballot. So I think the thing that would be in Boris Johnson's favour is the extent to which people really want independence and want the vote sooner rather than later. And I think on current opinion polling, they don't want it this year, may not want it next year, but I think Iain's point about a year and a half, maybe 2 years, I think it then comes into view because there is a majority for it within the term of the next Parliament.
Thank you. Now let's look at the economic questions. I mean, as Iain acknowledged, there's nothing impossible about Scotland being an independent country, the size of Denmark, the size of Ireland, nothing unfeasible, but there would be a hard border, as he described. It would be an unusual country that with its biggest trade barriers essentially be with its main trading partner. Although the UK has chosen that, of course, with Brexit to some degree. Andrew, can you talk us through this a bit? You're obviously the specialist on this. There are questions about Andrew Fraser about what's the level of understanding about the fiscal situation in Scotland, but also about this issue of, as Iain put, Brexit actually cuts the other way.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that, and Andrew, I think there is broad understanding. I mean, the debate on the fiscal position and so on has been decades long. I think on trade, this is a really important point, and it is a challenge. You know, clearly the Scottish government don't want a border in any direction, but we're having one imposed to our east and our west by the UK government's choice on Brexit, which is not an orderly one. The early implementation of that has been shambolic, not for political or constitutional reasons, just for lack of planning and engagement. And the reports from our manufactured exporters in particular are grim. But by the time we come to vote, there will have to be clarity in the proposition of exactly that is how exactly that is working going into Northern Ireland in particular and into the European Union. And there is no doubt that there are means by which this can be made less destructive, not just to trade going from Scotland to the rest of the UK, but also in the other direction. But when it boils down, this will be one of these trade-offs, which A, we need to be honest about, and B, we need to ask ourselves, you know, if you look at Ireland, where you are now, Bill, when Ireland joined the European community in 1974, more than 60%, I think I'm right in saying, of its exports went to the UK. Today, it's less than 10%. Is that good or bad for Ireland? Answer, good, because they've diversified. And as a result of that and other policies, their economy has boomed. Really, the question for Scots will be, and if you look at our manufactured exports, the stuff where the friction is most obvious at the moment, actually, the UK represents a very substantial market, but much more goes to the rest of the world in Europe than goes to the UK. The domination of the UK is when we bring in services to the equation. And I have to say, I'm as yet unclear about how that friction is operating for our service sectors. But we've got a period of time before the vote, if indeed it's going to happen. There's a vote, there's a period of time, as Iain says. And I think by that point, the trade-off will need to be set out honestly by the Scottish government and clearly. But the other point to say is, of course, it's only when independence de jure, you know, the flag is woven and Scotland is declared independent, it's only at that point that we can formally begin an accession process with the European Union. So the question and the challenge on borders is many, many years off. If you believe some academics, that process could take up to 5 years. It'll be at least, let's say it's 2 years to vote, 2 years to Independence Day beyond that. So we're talking the best part of a decade to plan and get this right. And I think, therefore, it's about, do we think it's worth it or don't we? We can come back on the other questions in due course, Bill. I've not touched on deficit. We can as you suit.
And no, thank you. And but let me toss in the currency quickly, though. I mean, so again, your view is that, and I think it's your recommendation in your report, that it would be a phased process for that too. You can't join the euro until you rejoin the European Union. In any case, so that option is out at least from day one. And your recommendation, if I remember, was to retain the pound.
Yeah, so it is to accept that we wouldn't have monetary policy sovereignty in the short to medium term, that the priority is to get the government set up to plan for the future, to begin the accession process. Because of the integration financially with the rest of the UK, it is in our interest to do it in this way. Actually, I spent the first year of the Growth Commission's work planning on how to launch a Scottish currency and peg it, and the challenges of that in the short term were such. I was listening to Mervyn King speak at the Edinburgh Book Festival of all places, where he put this as the better option. And clearly it means ceding sovereignty in the short term, but we know it will take time to set up anyway, and we recommend a series of tests to make sure that we'll get to Scottish currency. Of course, all countries do, but the small advanced economies, almost all of them either are in the euro or they peg their currency in some form to another major currency. Currency sovereignty is not really the route to success. If QE was the route to success, Japan and Britain would be the best performing economies in the world just now, and they aren't, with the best will. When you look to countries like New Zealand, it's about the same economic strength as Scotland, but much better performing on measures such as public finance. There are other countries we can emulate and we can get there. This is the orderly we think that de-risks the question from the perspective of investment and business. And that's the case I hope will be put if the referendum comes.
Iain, how do you respond to that? And what's your sort of message to like the business community as well? I mean, the Japanese business community essentially spoke up against Brexit. They wanted us to stay within the European Union. Would you want, as it were, foreign businesses in the UK to basically speak up for retaining the union now? So,
yes, I would hope that they would, but I'm not convinced that it will make much of a difference, because certainly at the moment, this is not really about economics. That's where, you know, I voted for Brexit, and I'm glad I did, but I was one of those acknowledging that it would be complex and difficult. Listening to Andrew talk about it, I'm reminded of that, but I think that in comparison to Brexit, which is the unwinding of a 40-year relationship, which has been extremely difficult, this would make Brexit look like a picnic. I think you're talking about something of a completely different order, the unwinding of a state with a shared currency, interwoven over the course of 300 years, and markets of a kind that market connections of a kind that you describe. The best case that Andrew has, and Andrew is one of the most reasonable and sophisticated nationalists I know, and that's long been the case, is the best case he has for independence is that in 20 or 30 years' time, it will sort of end up on the plus side for Scotland, that Scotland will be something like Denmark. I don't dispute that. That's absolutely fine. But I think the intervening 10 years of 15 years of disruption and ill feeling, and we can come to this in a minute, I think the disorderly and extremely unpleasant unraveling of the union, and I think it would be from an English perspective as a Scot who lives in England. I think the nationalists underestimate the English and underestimate what would be unleashed by this. The question is that worth it? Is it worth upending currency, cross-border cooperation and fealty and connection for something which could turn Scotland into a country like Denmark, fine, great, within 20 or 30 years, but might not as well. So that's the calculation. I mean, I also listened to Kieran Martin's stuff, and I thought it was Blavatnik, and I thought interesting, thoughtful guy, but I thought it was hopelessly naive, particularly on that question of what England becomes if the Scots say, do you know what, we're leaving the UK. The idea that Scotland then turns up the next morning preparing for a friendly conversation about how we can unravel this in an orderly fashion, I think is just for the birds.
And John Curtice, early on this, I mean, in terms of how Scotland thinks about the economic question, how prominent is it in your?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that in 2014 the economic question was crucial. If you kind of wanted to find one question about the consequences of independence, that in order to try to work out whether people vote yes or no, then it was people's attitudes towards the economic question that was crucial. And at the end of the day, although the Yes side made some progress on it during the campaign, one of the reasons why the Yes side didn't win is they didn't win the economic argument. But this does pretty rapidly get us back to Brexit, because certainly one of the things that is clear from research I've done, and it's also been replicated by another study, is that yes, people weren't convinced about the economic consequences of Brexit in 2014. However, what is now the position is that more people are concerned about the economic consequences of Brexit than they are about the economic consequences of independence. So in other words, Brexit has changed the apparent riskiness of independence, because in effect, given where we're at the moment, it isn't a choice between a status quo with which we are familiar and an alternative that might be risky. It's a choice between two unknown futures: the unknown future of the long-term consequence of Brexit and the unknown future of the long-term consequence of independence. So that certainly does help to explain why now, at least, although I think it's the case that the economic consequences of independence is still the area where people are most likely to be wary about the independence argument, what also seems to be clear is, however, is that they are less wary of it now than they were 7 years ago. And again, Brexit has been crucial in transforming that, because it basically has changed the nature of the calculation. Indeed, it's, Brexit's also fundamentally changed the nature of the choice. I mean, one way of characterizing what this is now about is that which is in Scotland's interest? Is it in its interest to be part of a relatively small single market that, however, is still Scotland's principal trading partner, and which does engage in quite substantial fiscal transfers? Or is it better off being in a much larger single market, second most important export market, but one that's only just begun to put its toe in the water of fiscal transfers? Now, once you put it that way, you can see how potentially the economic arguments begin to look more nuanced, and it is, as Andrew suggested, very much a bet as to whether or not Scotland's long-term interests lie on maintaining its links with England, which was a pretty good bet in 1707, given what happened to the British Empire, or whether its long-term interests are better by being linked with Germany and the European Union, whose more recent economic record has arguably been better for the most part than that of the UK. So it's, I think, a much more nuanced choice, and in some senses quite a substantial strategic choice, where I think we'll end up discovering there's some pretty important arguments on both sides of the fence.
I think just one quick point on the economics of it. I mean, John puts it very well, but it's worth remembering what's changed in those 7 years is that since the last referendum, is that unionists are now, and there just simply isn't an honest debate about the economics of this Andrew makes a really valuable contribution to it, but broadly out there in the Scottish media and the Scottish public life, there cannot be an honest conversation about the fiscal and monetary realities because voters do not want to hear it. And that is that is a result of the way in which the referendum played last time. Very similar to the Brexit campaign, where the Remain side deployed logical, rational economic arguments and were castigated as being proponents of Project Fear. The result of that is now, as you will hardly ever hear a unionist politician, it's left to the IFS and various other independent organizations to flag up the gulf in terms of funding and how well Scotland does out of the union. It's left to them because unionist parties are afraid of being accused of being anti-Scottish. The moment you say this, look at this extra funding, which I have absolutely no problem with. It has worked in the other, that's the point of a union. The subsidy, the direction, it has worked in the other way. If you look at what happened with the oil industry and the politics of the 60s, 70s and 1980s, it now effectively, I don't like the word subsidy, but Scotland does quite well out of the union at the moment. That may change, and other parts of the UK may, over the course of 20, 30, 40, 50 years, start to do better. But that's a union. That's what that process of transfer is about. But I just wanted to underline how a rational debate on this is not possible with voters at the moment when they just don't want to hear it.
Well, can I come in on that? Because I there's a couple of important points to make here. The first is, Iain, that the one characteristic that both the Remain campaign and the No campaign had in 2016 and 2014 respectively was indeed a focus on the negatives of the alternative proposition. What was absent was a clear statement and agreement about how you would manage Scotland's future within the framework of the union in such a way that it was in Scotland's interests. Now, of course, there's a crucial reason why that was the case, because at the end of the day, the parties to the unionist political camp, viz. Conservative and Labour, do not agree on the answer to that question. And indeed, one of the strategic problems facing the unionist camp now is that they're in much the same position as the Remain camp were in 2019. All agreed about what they don't like, all agreed about what they think is an inevitable consequence of Brexit, but utterly unable to agree with each other about what was the positive alternative they would put forward. But that then brings me on to the second point. I mean, I agree with you that indeed unionist politicians are remarkably absent in their discussion about what is the case for the union. And indeed, during this election so far, they seem intent on continuing to argue about the process point about whether there should be a referendum or not, as opposed to arguing why actually they think independence is a bad idea. And the truth is that arguing on the process point is a complete waste of time, because at the end of the day, about 90% of those people who are in favor of independence actually want there to be a referendum at some point during the course of the next 5 years. So you're not going to dissuade them of the merits of voting for the SNP on arguing about process. You actually have to engage in the substantive debate. And I think the honest truth is that so far, at least, unionists seem very, very reluctant to actually engage in the substantive debate about the union, as opposed to engaging in arguments about process and what the SNP did or didn't say in a referendum campaign 7 years ago.
So, Andrew, our friend Michael McClay has asked further to these questions, really, about the economic issue and the fiscal thing. He says, do you, Andrew, not see any deterioration in Scotland's short to medium term economic viability and sustainability since the last referendum and since your commission reported, and since Brexit and the pandemic? As it were, leaving aside whether the debate is possible, rationally, has it got a harder argument to have if it goes on to the rational basis?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, if you were arguing in the past that independence would produce a free and easy solution and result because of oil, not really a self-reliance or self-responsibility solution, and to be honest, that's what I and the SNP argued for far too long. So the collapse of oil revenues since then has pointed up the need for the prospectus to be completely different, which certainly in the report I and others produced for the Scottish Government, it is. I think it probably boils, I mean, to Iain's points, there's so much we've just heard. I do think full success takes at least a generation to produce. That doesn't mean to say that benefits don't accrue quickly, but in all candor, pretending that you could get to be a society and economy of the quality and performance of Denmark overnight wouldn't be truthful. But you can begin purposefully to put right and put yourselves on a path to that. Social transformation, economic transformation takes a generation. That's the truth. To Iain's point about, but by the way, by not starting it and by regarding the best you can hope for is to be an underperforming part of an underperforming country and then living on subventions or subsidies from the southeast of England is no long-term solution. It's why the UK has one of the least well-performing economies in the developed world. I wanted to pick up, though, if I may, Iain's really good point, and this is where and he's obviously got much more experience of living in London and in the southeast than I do. I've got strong family ties. I've worked there a lot through the course of my life. I have greater hope for the response of the people in the rest of the UK, and I also think that the relationship that we will seek to obtain will be of the closest between any two countries anywhere. But here's the why of it. The government publishes a balance sheet for the United Kingdom public sector. It shows assets, and we can argue about the valuation, but assets of roughly 2.5 trillion and liabilities of 4 trillion and growing, which are made up of debt, unfunded public sector state pensions and underfunded public sector pensions, a couple of $100 billion there for the decommissioning of Sellafield. So actually the negotiation is not about Scotland saying, please, can we get access to these assets? And this, Iain, was the point that Kieran Martin was making. But actually it's about the UK saying, Scotland, you ought to shoulder the burden of taking on these liabilities. And so the power in that negotiation is equal. And the Scottish Government proposals that we've put, which is not really well reported yet in the debate outside of, in fact, it's not reported anywhere. The proposal is to have an annual solidarity payment going from Scotland to the rest of the UK to meet our fair share of debt interest payments, continuing shared services, whatever they may be. And so the tone set is the singular opposite of what the UK said to the European Union on Brexit, which was, effectively up yours, Dolores, we're not paying. And of course they did in the end. The Scottish Government would take a completely different tonal approach. So I think that is the nutshell. And the other thing to say in conclusion, if I may, Bill, is Brexit has increased the riskiness of the union massively. And that's why I think people's minds are really turning to it. The world is full of risk. Whatever you choose now in the current outlook, whether it's climate, inequality, automation, all that's coming ahead, is do we trust ourselves to navigate a stormy sea, or whatever the UK votes, whether it's Boris Johnson or whomever else, is that always better? And I don't think that's as good as it gets from our perspective democratically.
I was just reminded, as I sort of laughably call myself a moderate Brexiteer, which means, I can critique some of my sort of wilder fellow Brexiteers. But when I heard Andrew there talking about how the negotiation would be equal, I felt I was back in time, back in sort of 2017 with, I don't know, David Davis or someone else saying that they'll give us a deal because it's in their mutual interest. Actually, I don't think that is how the UK would handle it at all. And I thought Kieran Martin had completely missed the point. My guess would be that the English government or the rest of the UK government would not engage in any such discussion about the debt. I think the Treasury would basically swallow it, because the cost of then entering into if you give us this, then you might allow us to have your to keep nuclear weapons on the Clyde for the next 20 years. And then what does that payment facilitate in terms of currency? I think it would be a hard stop with just swallow it on the debt. And what everyone seems to be missing about the nuclear weapons is absolutely obvious. They're not going to stay on the Clyde. If Scotland votes for independence, they will go to the east coast of the US. I mean, defense experts have talked about this for years. There isn't if the nationalists think that there's a kind of bargaining chip, well, if you're nice to us and you try and maintain a light border with us, we'll sort of will cash your check once a year and be nice to you in the hope that you let nuclear weapons stay there. I don't think that is what will happen, because, and I view this as a historian, this is, I think, the tragedy of it, is that it reopens the question which the Union dealt with, and that was to deal with essentially, and it was cynical, but it was cynical from a Scottish point of view in terms of access to trading routes as well. It was about England having at its northern border a potentially hostile power that had allied with England's opponents on continental Europe. That's the reason that the Union was done. Now, we live in a very different era, a peaceful era, thankfully, but the geopolitics would still be that to the north of England, a state was attempting to rejoin the European Union, not, certainly at the moment, allies of the United Kingdom, certainly competitors of the United Kingdom. What this opens up in terms of English attitudes, and I think most English people, great fan of the English, most English people would be civil and reasonable about it. But when it came to the negotiations, I think they would be absolutely hard as nails.
Well, I think that that's a very important point. We've come to the end of our time, unfortunately, but what the point particularly it emphasizes, which I regret not pursuing more, is that context is what is really very important for this. And this is not simply a context of England, Scotland. It is, as it were, it's not a Six Nations, but it's a Four Nations and possibly Five Nations, since the Republic of Ireland has a bit of a stake in this as well. We would be seeing this as being a multi-dimensional jigsaw, and of course the future of the UK will be part of it. This has been an unusual webinar for the Japan Society to run, since it's not been touching on Japan, but the future of the United Kingdom is very important for all of us and for all of our Japanese community who are living here in the UK, in all of the nations of it. And so I'm going to absolutely warmly thank Iain Martin, John Curtice, and Andrew Wilson for giving us the time and great expertise, and it's been a very informative discussion. Thank you to you all.